who is Audrey Looby. Audrey is a PhD candidate at the University of Florida. She's in the Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences group and also at the Nature Coastal Biological Station. She works both in my lab and in Charlie Martin's lab. For her dissertation, she focuses on fish sound production and coastal soundscape ecology, and she's going to talk about some of the results from her dissertation today. Some of the other cool things that Audrey does, she co-leads an international effort called Fish Sounds, and that compiles global fish sound production information and recordings, and that's compiled on a website called fishsounds.net. And I think Audrey will link that website and at the end of her presentation. Before doing her PhD, she did a master's at the University of Florida. And she did that in freshwater lake systems where she looked at the effects of submerged aquatic vegetation restoration on fish use of that habitat. And prior to her bachelor's, she did a undergrad degree at the University of Southern California, and she conducted biodiversity monitoring in California kelp forest as part of that research. In between her undergrad and her master's, she was a research assistant at the Smithsonian Marine Station, and she worked in both Florida and in Belize. So I'm excited for you to hear about Audrey's work, and I will turn over the screen to her.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that introduction, and for Savannah and Laura for inviting me to present today. I'm just going to get my screen set up. Oh, I'm going to reshare just in case. Got a bunch of sounds for you today, so I want to make sure you all can hear it. So hopefully we're all set on that. One more adjustment. All right, Laura and Savannah, are you seeing the correct screen? Thank you. Awesome. All right, so for today, I'm going to be talking to you about the sounds of a living shoreline in Cedar Key, Florida. This is work I led as part of my PhD dissertation, as Laura mentioned, but was also done in collaboration with my advisors, Charlie and Laura, as well as Ashley, Savannah, and Mark, who were kind enough to let me take advantage of their larger Daughtry Bayou Living Shoreline project for this study. In my presentation, I'm going to give you some background on sounds underwater and living shorelines. I'll then walk you through the methods and results of this case study that had several different sampling methods. And finally, I'll give you some of my takeaways from this research regarding intertidal soundscapes, acoustic sampling, and the relationships between living shorelines and the sounds around them. So let's start with some background. First, I'm excited to introduce you to the world of underwater sounds. Marine, estuarine, and coastal environments can be quite cacophonous places filled with sounds from a variety of sources. These include sounds from the environment, such as from waves, wind, rain, or even earthquakes. There are also plenty of sounds from underwater animals. Most of you are probably familiar with whale songs and dolphin echolocation, but plenty of fishes and invertebrates use sound for communication too. Even sounds that are produced incidentally as the result of other activities like splashing, swimming, or chewing can convey valuable information as well. We humans can also make quite a racket underwater with activities ranging from construction, drilling, shipping, or sonar. These human sounds are often referred to as anthropogenic noise or noise pollution because of the potential harms they can cause to marine life, including stress, behavioral changes, direct damage, or even death. We call the sounds found in a particular location a soundscape. Animals can learn a lot about what's going on in the environment around them by listening to the soundscape. We humans can eavesdrop on them to get information too, through the use of underwater microphones called hydrophones to listen and record these many sounds. These underwater recorders can be placed in a fixed position to capture information over time, or they can be moved around to capture information over space. These recordings can then be taken back to a computer where they can be visualized and described quantitatively based on things like frequency, volume, complexity, sound sources, or other metrics. Acoustic monitoring can offer a relatively easy, cost-effective, and non-invasive sampling method that can be used to gain information about the environment, like what species are present in an area and what they're doing. It can also provide ecological information about the functions different sounds might be providing, like sounds for attracting mates or finding suitable habitat. To give you an idea of just a few of these underwater sounds, I'm going to play a recording, some recordings I took from the dock of the Nature Coast Biological Station in Cedar Key with the underwater recorder shown in the picture. In this first clip, you'll hear the boop boop calls of Gulf toadfish, some invertebrate clicks, and some water movement sounds. And here's a clip from just a couple minutes earlier when a recreational boat was passing nearby, masking or overpowering a lot of those natural sounds. And trust me, if you find just a few seconds of that sound as annoying as I do, imagine how organisms underwater might feel with short or prolonged exposure. Marinate on that for later. These underwater soundscapes, like what you just listened to, are inextricably linked to the ecosystems they're found in, which is why researchers like me are so excited to study them. Now, as you may have guessed from my talk title, for today I'll be discussing the soundscape associated with a living shoreline. Living shorelines, like the one shown in this picture, use natural materials to stabilize coastlines. They can often perform as well or even better than other hardened shoreline stabilization techniques like seawalls, breaks, or riprap at protecting shorelines from wave action, storms, and erosion. They also often have the added benefit of providing similar functions to natural shorelines, like creating habitat for wildlife or improving water quality. I'm not going to get into most of these topics today, so if you're interested in learning more about living shorelines in general, like how they can attenuate wave action, protect shorelines from storms, and how they're being used in the Nature Coast, then I recommend checking out Savannah and Mark's previous Nature Coast Currents seminar covering all of these subjects available on YouTube. For my work, though, I primarily wanted to find out what impact a living shoreline construction would have on the underwater sound. In constructing a living shoreline, there would be an increase in more complex habitat structure from salt marsh plants and artificial reefs. And I hypothesized that this increase in more complex structure would lead to an increase in the abundance of intertidal organisms like fishes and crustaceans because they would prefer the new habitat. The increase in populations would then lead to an increase in soundscape volume from the presence of more sound producers. And as certain foundational species that build habitats, including oysters, actually settle down to grow in response to hearing the sounds of healthy habitats, then my hypothesized increase in soundscape volume could also lead to an increase in oyster settlement, which would then help increase the habitat complexity. This feedback loop might be complicated, however, by the change in habitat type. As for example, salt marsh plants might increase the attenuation or dampening of sound because of air bubbles in and around them. So depending on the strength of the effects, the change in habitat type could either counteract any changes to the number of sound producers or remain low enough that the positive relationships among the other components still stand. Which leads me to this case study where I set out to investigate these hypothesized relationships with several different sampling methods. I conducted this research along G Street in Cedar Key, Florida at a hardened shoreline and a living shoreline. The hardened shoreline site and the living shoreline site prior to construction were fairly similar, made up of concrete structures. Then to build the living shoreline, Savannah, Mark, their team, and a bunch of volunteers replenished the whole living shoreline site with sand, deployed reef structures, and planted salt marsh plants. So in my first sampling effort, I looked at the changes to the soundscape and next-in communities following this living shoreline construction. This is an aerial view of my sites in Cedar Key with the bright green shape drawn to represent roughly where the salt marsh was planted, surrounded by castle blocks and reef prisms, while the area to the right of it was turned into a recreational beach. I conducted acoustic sampling at 2 locations at each of my sites. I took 5-minute snapshot recordings at each of these 4 locations with a portable passive acoustic recorder deployed on this PVC stand, sparking a lot of curiosity from many a passerby thinking I might be trying some fancy new fishing technique. I always conducted my sampling in the late morning at high tide, and I had 21 different sampling events from October 2019 until August of 2021, covering 10 months before the living shoreline construction to a year after the construction. To give you an idea of what my recording sounded like, here's a clip from my very first sampling session taken from location 1. You should mostly hear those crackling sounds that are invertebrate sounds, likely mostly produced by snapping shrimp. Using my recordings, like the one you just listened to, I wanted to see if there were any differences between the living and hardened shoreline sites before and after the living shoreline construction, as well as seasonally. As is commonly done in underwater soundscape studies, I divided my acoustic data into two frequency bands for my analysis. This visualization is called a spectrogram, with time on the x-axis, frequency or pitch on the y-axis, and ladder volume shown with brighter colors. The higher frequency band, which for this study I defined as 2 to 22 kilohertz, is usually dominated by invertebrate sounds, such as the crackling you just heard. The low frequency band, which I defined as 100 to 2000 hertz, is often dominated by fish sounds, such as the Gulf toadfish boop boop calls shown in this figure, the same ones you heard earlier. And depending on the source, environmental and human sounds may also be present in either or both of these bands. By dividing my recordings into two frequency bands for my analysis, I was able to assess sounds from largely independent sound sources and ensure that one particularly overpowering sound that might be present in only certain frequencies wouldn't obfuscate what could be different patterns going on in another frequency band. So let's look at my sampling results. These graphs show my soundscape sampling data with time on the x-axis and mean sound pressure level on the y-axis, which you can think of as average volume within each frequency band. The dotted black line shows when the living shoreline was constructed, and the smooth lines of the two sites are shown in different colors. I'm going to show a couple more of these graphs that will have a similar layout, and in all the figures I'll show, the living shoreline data will always be in light green and the hardened shoreline will be in dark blue. As for what I found in my data, the low frequency band wasn't adequately described by any of the variables I looked at in my model testing. The high frequency band varied primarily by season and the interaction of season and before-after construction, indicating that seasonal trends differed between years. But the high frequency band didn't vary by site before after the living shoreline construction or any of the other interaction terms I tested. While I was disappointed to not find any differences between the sites or as the result of the living shoreline construction, the strong seasonal variation in the high frequency band does make sense. Several environmental variables like temperature and tide height fluctuated similarly with season. Variables like these can have very strong influences both on how sound travels underwater as well as on sound producer abundances and their sound production rates. As for the low frequency band, though my model didn't adequately describe the variation observed, there is still a potentially ecologically relevant difference between the sites due to the presence of a loud, chronic human-made sound. This is what the sound looks like in the spectrogram, and here's what it sounds like. Pretty annoying, right? This sound was pretty much only present at my living shoreline sampling locations for most but not all of the days I sampled. I was able to pinpoint its likely location as this decommissioned stormwater drainage pipe just next to the living shoreline site. And I suspect the sound could have been produced from a water pump somewhere in the stormwater drain, as I've recorded similar sounds near other pumps, but I can't say for sure. Even if I don't know what caused it though, I know it was quite loud. This graph shows a summary of the average sound volume on the y-axis across different frequencies on the x-axis, averaged across all of my hardened shoreline recordings on the left and living shoreline recordings on the right. For the frequencies my mystery sound was found in, it increased the relative volume by over 20 decibels, shown by these peaks present in the living shoreline data, but not the hardened shoreline data. And why is this sound possibly ecologically important? Well, as I mentioned earlier, human-made sounds can cause significant behavioral changes, stress, damage, or even death to a variety of marine animals. As just one example, one recent study that looked at the effects of underwater noise exposure from, funnily enough, a music festival, found that when Gulf toadfish, the fish who made the boop boop sounds you heard earlier, experienced just a 7 to 9 decibel increase in noise exposure, they had a 4 to 5-fold increase in their plasma cortisol, their main stress hormone. The fact that this potentially stressful sound was present at the living shoreline site could hurt some of its otherwise beneficial ecological services, though we'd need more research to sort out exactly what. So this was one sound source, But what about other sound producers or just animals in general present at the sites? Well, thanks to the broader living shoreline monitoring going on at these sites, I was able to look at changes to the nectin community, including fishes and mobile macroinvertebrates like blue crabs, over the same time frame as my long-term soundscape sampling. Unfortunately, the data from these sampling efforts were too variable to look at trends statistically, with a lot of zero catch and a couple of strong outliers. Despite my limited statistical power, I did find that over half of the species caught in the fyke nets and minnow traps were known sound producers, including species like Gulf killifish, pinfish, black drum, and white shrimp. And there are many other species like snapping shrimp that are known to be present in the region, even if we didn't catch them in this sampling. So part of the inconclusive results in both the acoustic and nectin sampling may have been caused by slow initial development of the living shoreline. This aerial photo shows the site prior to construction. And this next photo shows the site 3 months after construction, where you can see the sand additions, the artificial reef structures, and some sparse salt marsh plants. Even 9 months after construction, though, and shortly before the end of my acoustic and nectin sampling data, there was still limited salt marsh growth. So much so that the Living Shoreline project team decided to deploy additional reef structures and salt marsh plants shortly after this third photo was taken. This extra planting, along with additional time, eventually led to improved salt marsh density, which is about how the site looks now. The slow development, though, means some of the expected ecological changes from the Living Shoreline construction may only have begun in earnest after the completion of the acoustic and nectin sampling. Our sampling methodology may have also been insufficient to detect any more minor changes that may have occurred. So because of the potential limitations I just mentioned, I decided to look at more in-depth acoustic sampling with different methods a year after the shoreline was constructed to see if there would be the predicted soundscape differences. This time, I wanted to look at soundscape changes between different times of day and my 2 sites about a year after the living shoreline construction. I conducted this acoustic sampling at a central location at each of my sites. This time, I also had fancier recorders that could be fully submerged and record continuously for longer periods of time. I attached these recorders to the concrete blocks and deployed them at these locations, again, sparking a lot of curiosity from people passing by. I deployed them for 2 separate days over the same week so I could capture the soundscape with high tide falling at sunrise, midday, sunset, and night. As I was interested in the intertidal soundscapes and my sites were very shallow, I only looked at the times when my recorders were fully submerged for the 90 minutes before and after high tide. I also divided my recordings into the same low and high frequency bands as my previous soundscape sampling. So in looking at my data this time, in both the low and high frequency bands, the living shoreline was significantly louder than the hardened shoreline, with average volume again shown on the y-axis and significant differences represented with capital letters. This difference was primarily related to biological sounds like the crackling invertebrate sounds you keep hearing, as the mystery chronic human sound wasn't present in these recordings. In terms of time of day when high tide occurred, there was no significant difference in the low frequency band, but in the high frequency band, midday was the loudest while dusk was the quietest. So yay, the living shoreline was indeed louder than the reference hardened shoreline a year after it was constructed, as I predicted. I had some answers related to my original research question, but I still wanted to see if there were any impacts of the change in habitat on sound travel. So I looked at the acoustic attenuation or sound dampening at my 2 sites using in situ field measurements also over a year after the living shoreline was constructed. I had 5 transects at each site that ran both perpendicular and roughly parallel to shore. At the beginning of each transect, I placed an underwater speaker and broadcast broadband white noise from the speaker for 2 minutes. So this is what it sounded like. For my measurements, first I recorded these speaker sounds with 2 recorders, both placed at 1 meter from the speaker to serve as a form of calibration. Then I left one recorder at 1 meter and moved the other at increasing distances from the speaker. So it recorded at 6 meters, 11 meters, and 16 meters from the speaker. I could then calculate the difference in the received sounds between the 2 recorders to compare between transects, distances, and sites. These measurements were conducted in the late morning at high tide over the course of 2 consecutive days with the transect order randomized. So first, I want to give you an idea of what my acoustic attenuation recordings looked like. These are some different sound visualizations from 4 select recordings from my sampling. You should be familiar with spectrograms at this point, while the visualizations above the spectrograms are called waveforms. So show overall volume on the y-axis over time on the x-axis for the same recordings. The recordings on the left are from a transect at the Hardin shoreline that ran mostly through open water, while the recordings on the right are from a transect at the Living shoreline that ran through a dense area of salt marsh plants. The figures on the top are from the recorder kept close to the speaker, while the ones at the bottom shows the recorder that was moved further away. The colorful blocks represent the different times the speaker sounds were received by the recorder, which could sometimes have been received at different volumes between distances or recorders. So from the Hardin shoreline transect, you can see the received speaker sound volume diminish slowly with distance, while in the salt marsh of the Living shoreline, it pretty immediately drops out and becomes undetectable. Visual assessments like these showed me that my sampling methods generally worked at capturing attenuation variation between individual transects and distances. And based on my preliminary assessments, I also decided for the purposes of my analysis to exclude the 16-meter distance, as there were rarely perceivable speaker sounds at that distance. And I also only looked at the sound within the 7 to 12 kilohertz frequency band, as it had the loudest speaker sounds. So although I observed variance between individual transects like we just looked at, when I analyzed my acoustic attenuation measurements statistically, the overall sites were not significantly different. The y-axis of these violin plots shows the average transmission loss between the sites at the different distances between my 2 recorders shown in the different panels. Higher transmission loss means more acoustic attenuation or sound dampening. The black dotted lines are just for reference, showing the expected transmission loss ranges based on a simple cylindrical model estimate of sound travel underwater. So while acoustic attenuation did increase with greater distance as expected, the sites did not differ. This lack of significance is likely due to the fact that not all of the Living shoreline site was planted with salt marsh plants, and that a lot of it was left as a recreational beach. From my measurements, the acoustic attenuation was quite high where the salt marsh was planted, with the speaker noise generally unable to be detected at 6 meters from the speaker. But the transect on the recreational beach without plants had as little attenuation as most of the transects of the Hardin shoreline. The variation within both sites was greater than the differences between them, meaning the Living shoreline construction had only limited effects on acoustic attenuation when analyzed at the site level. So now with all of this data in mind, let's walk through some of the main takeaways of this research. First, my work demonstrated that intertidal soundscapes can have meaningful differences even when they were just down the street from each other. The Living shoreline was louder a year following its construction, largely the result of natural biological sounds. There was also the loud human sound I primarily found at the Living shoreline site during my long-term acoustic sampling that had substantial contributions to the low frequency band. As intertidal soundscapes have only been rarely described, this work adds to the relatively limited existing research about them. The study also demonstrates that acoustic sampling can provide valuable information for monitoring efforts. In this work, our Nicton sampling data couldn't reasonably be analyzed statistically because of generally low catch with a few outliers, though it still provided observational information about what species were present at the sites. While my acoustic sampling data were able to detect seasonal, diel, and site differences. Acoustic sampling might therefore be beneficial for other monitoring efforts to supplement or complement more traditional methods. This work also lends support to my starting hypothesis that living shorelines can affect the soundscape in ways that can promote their continued development. Though my Nicton data were inconclusive, I did find that a year following the living shoreline construction, it did have a louder soundscape compared to the Hardin shoreline. The acoustic attenuation of the living shoreline site did not differ significantly from the Hardin shoreline, and it also did not seem to have a strong enough effect to keep the living shoreline site from having that louder soundscape. The rest of my conceptual model is supported by other studies showing oyster larvae settle in response to louder natural soundscapes, and that Nicton communities do frequently increase following a living shoreline construction. While this work only represents a case study of how intertidal soundscapes might change with habitat enhancement, it still provides support for the existence of relationships between habitats and soundscapes and illustrates how these interactions can aid in habitat enhancement and restoration. Taking these relationships a step further, you could even speed up these positive feedback loops with acoustic enrichment. In other words, playing the sounds of natural soundscapes from underwater speakers to improve restoration outcomes, as has worked on coral and oyster reef restorations. So I hope this field study will present new ecological bases for understanding habitat enhancement and restoration. I also hope a more holistic consideration of the role soundscapes play in ecosystem processes can be applied to facilitate management efforts like habitat enhancement and noise pollution regulations for improved marine conservation. If the topics I've covered today have piqued your curiosity about underwater sounds and you're interested in learning more, then I recommend checking out a research website that I co-lead at fishsounds.net, the same one that Laura mentioned at the beginning, where you can hear more fish sound recordings or see if your favorite species is a known sound producer. If you're interested in more general information, like how sound travels underwater or the study of marine sounds, then I also recommend checking out the website Discovery of Sound in the Sea at docets.org. With that, I want to acknowledge all the people and institutions who have been involved in this research so far, including the Daughtry Bayou Living Shorelines team, volunteers, and funders. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions, or you can reach out to me online. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, for that talk. Folks are, I'm sure, spending a little time answering the poll, but if you have any questions for Audrey, you're welcome to type them into the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask Audrey questions directly. And if folks are getting ready for that, I will ask you the first question. I was wondering if there are other examples of like introducing habitat through something like restoration. How long would you expect it to take for the animal community to increase and for sound to increase?
Yeah, so in the case of living shorelines, from some of the studies I've read, I think it can be quite slow to see any changes to the biological communities. I think up to even 10 years before some monitoring efforts were able to detect them. And even with that, a lot of monitoring efforts don't last long enough to detect more meaningful differences. And so it can be quite slow. And as a result, the same changes to the soundscape might be slow as well. For others, this is the first study, as far as I know, that's documented the soundscapes of a living shoreline. And so I don't have any other ones to compare it to. But for other types of restorations like oyster reefs or coral reefs, then sometimes it can be, within a year or two, or sometimes they face similar challenges of really slow changes occurring to the soundscape or biological communities.
Thanks. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you, Audrey. That was wonderful. It really opens up a different perspective. Sometimes we stick our head under the water, but we rarely get that opportunity. My question is even though you showed a strong attenuation related to the vegetation, I guess I'm curious, how is it the intensity of those anthropogenic sounds or the frequency of the anthropogenic sounds that seems to be so prominent, or I guess being able to travel much further? And I guess maybe both, but either way, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
For sure, yeah. So what I was curious in seeing some of why I did the attenuation measurements was in case I didn't see a change to living shoreline soundscape, to try to figure out whether it would be related to the attenuation effects of the vegetation, or if it would be, some other causes related to the biological communities and sound producers. But in my case, I found sort of the opposite of what I was expecting, where the attenuation was a lot less at the site level, whereas the soundscape was louder. And in this case, the anthropogenic sounds can be very, very loud underwater. And so even if you have some attenuation effects from things like vegetation, you can still get those sounds crossing through. And some of the more extreme examples of this is for things like when you're building a wind turbine, there's a lot of pounding going on. Those sounds can be super harmful, particularly to marine mammals that have a lot of conservation efforts around them. And so they'll actually deploy bubble curtains so that they'll have a whole slew of bubbles to try to attenuate those sounds. And even then, you can still get some of those sounds crossing through just at much lower intensities. And then for the biological sound side, snapping shrimp snaps, like I suspect a lot of the crackling you were hearing was produced from, are also one of the loudest sound producers in the ocean, particularly in respect to their size. And so they might also be able to overcome any attenuation effects as well.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Savannah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the recordings that you collected would be sufficient or high quality enough to do any kind of analysis of like species identity or possibly looking at diversity of the types of animals that are making sounds. And I know that was beyond the scope of what you were looking at, but I was just curious if you had any maybe hints, since you've listened to a lot of this, if that might be different between the two sites.
Mm-hmm. For sure, that is a subject of huge interest in soundscape analyses, and one that I didn't really broach as much for this. But for a lot of terrestrial soundscapes, there are all these kinds of acoustic indices that can correlate to things like biodiversity indices. So if you have more birds calling, then that'll relate pretty directly to bird diversity in certain ecosystems. Unfortunately, underwater, we haven't had as much success with that, partially because it's really hard to identify a lot of the sound producers underwater, even as much as like these invertebrate crackling sounds that a lot of people report all over the world on many coastal environments. It's only like suspected snapping shrimp because a lot of other invertebrates might be able to make some of the crackling sounds that we find in there as well. And even in terms of fish sounds, I didn't really detect many fish sounds, if any, in my recordings, and certainly no obvious ones. And so that kind of requires specific species having very specific calls that you are able to identify. So the Gulf toadfish that I keep mentioning, the boop boop sounds drawn here in our lovely Fish Sounds logo on the slide as well, they produce really identifiable sounds, but they only do it some of the time. And so if you want to find out about Gulf toadfish, they're a great candidate for listening to their sounds, but for other species, it becomes a lot trickier. And we're still sorting out exactly the best ways to do all that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see Alex had a question in the chat. She says, you may have touched on this before, but are certain organisms more sensitive to anthropogenic sounds than others? Generally, yes. A lot of different organisms have very different hearing abilities. And they can even be so varied that it's kind of hard to make generalizations about how well they're detecting different sounds and how they detect the sounds as well. There's a lot of different properties different from how we hear sounds. With the components of how sound travels underwater, that they're attuned to both acoustic pressure, which you can think of like the frequency and stuff that we're used to, but also particle motion, which is how particles are vibrating essentially underwater. And so all of these factors influence how well organisms can hear and things like that. But based on more experimental studies, fish that, for example, that have more sensitive hearings or more developed hearing structures are also more sensitive to anthropogenic sounds. And then frequency can also be quite important, as some species might only be really sensitive to sounds at low frequencies, for example. So if you have a high frequency anthropogenic sound, then maybe it doesn't affect them as much. And so it can really vary, and it's still very much a field that we're still figuring out exactly what all the effects are of these anthropogenic sounds.
Cool. Well, I had one more question. If there's time, I know that you sort of concluded that measuring the soundscape might be a important tool in the monitoring toolbox. And I think that you participated some in the more traditional nectin sampling for this survey too. So I wondered if you could give us a little bit of an idea of what the labor for the traditional nectin sampling versus the soundscape sampling, both in the field and sort of on the back end.
Sure. Yeah. So with the nectin sampling data, the monitoring project that was mostly led by Ashley and Charlie, but like Laura said, I volunteered to tag along with them sometimes, was with fyke nets and minnow traps. And so for the fyke nets at my sites, there would be one fyke net per site. For the minnow traps, there were 4 locations per site with 4 minnow traps per location as well. And so there was a lot of coverage from that. And it would take about a day to do one set, like the minnow traps, and then one day with the fyke nets with about 2 to 3 people participating. And then with that, we would count the fish and measure them, and then sort of record the data that way. And then on the data processing side, you just enter in what you found in the spreadsheets, and then your data is there kind of ready to be analyzed. Whereas for the passive acoustic stuff, it can be really, really easy to just put a recorder in the water. For cost, they're pretty, like the fancy recorders I used are pretty comparable to the cost of one fyke net. But the challenge really comes on the back end with the acoustic analyses. There's not really a clear standardized way to analyze underwater soundscapes. And there's a lot of different recommendations out there, but it can kind of be very study dependent what you're supposed to do. And so in my case, I used a really cool new tool called Manta, which it operates in MATLAB, but you can just push a few buttons in like a plugin instead. So I didn't even have to do MATLAB coding. And with that, I was able to get my soundscape metrics a lot faster than if I had to manually code everything myself. But that even is not necessarily standardized or helpful for every study, as it mostly just looks at volume across frequency. So if you're interested in more things like complexity or sound sources, then that might require you to manually page through hours and hours of recordings, depending on what you're looking for, which is what I'm currently doing for my Gulf toadfish sound study. And so it can really vary quite a lot. And the ease of deployment kind of obfuscates the labor-intensive nature of the analyses currently. But again, just to reiterate, there's a lot of efforts I'm aware of that are trying to make those processes a lot easier through artificial intelligence, machine learning, or applications like that Manta package I mentioned.
Great. It sounds like there's a lot of trade-offs there.
For sure.
Anybody else have any questions for Audrey? All right. Well, thank you again, Audrey, for a great talk, and I hope to see a lot of you folks back next month for our Nature Coast Current talk, which I believe is on snow.
Thank you all so much for listening and for the hosting again.